this semester, so exactly. All right, good. So we're on. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's a pleasure to have with us today Tyler Goodspeed from the Hoover Institution, and he's going to be sharing with us his research on a tale of two recoveries, Scholar 9 to 2021. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Carlos. Good to be here. And apologies, Carlos. I think you'll probably, given the topic, you'll probably hear a fair amount of what we talked about this morning on the podcast.
Okay.
Yeah, so I wanted to just reflect a little bit on what. So I served on the Council of Economic Advisors for 3.5 years under the previous administration. And for those of you who don't know, the Council of Economic Advisors is an organization that sits within the Executive Office of the President, and it consists of academic economists, most of whom are on leave from home academic institutions or else detailed over to the Executive Office from their home organizations like the Federal Reserve, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they're on detail for anywhere from 6 months to a year. And the council's job is basically to be a sort of in-house think tank and referee advising on, what is good economic policy, what's bad economic policy, to analyze economic data as it becomes available. And so I started out as a senior economist working mostly on tax and macro stuff. As an economic historian, I had a lot of experience with time series analysis. So I thought I was mostly going to be doing a bit of forecasting and analysis of taxes, and then very quickly you sort of get pulled into a number of different projects, and before I knew it, a year became 2 years, and then was elevated to member, and I thought, well, I should probably stick around a bit longer, and then COVID hit, and I thought I don't want to be one of those people who leaves in the middle of a once in a generation, once in a century pandemic and the biggest economic contraction since 1932, so stuck around a bit longer. But I wanted to reflect today about what, in my 3.5 years on the council, was experienced very much as two economic recoveries. So the first was what I would describe as a recovery from the slowest economic recovery in post-war US history. And the second was then the recovery from the 2020 pandemic recession. So when we entered the Council of Economic Advisors, the team that entered in 2017, we spent a lot of time sort of studying the aftermath of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. And we saw that it was somewhat of an anomalous recovery. So typically in the aftermath of a recession, you see a big rebound, and the magnitude of that rebound is very strongly correlated with the magnitude of the preceding contraction. This is what Milton Friedman called a plucking model of business fluctuations. You can think of it like plucking the string on a violin bow, that the amplitude of a contraction is strongly correlated with the amplitude of the subsequent expansion. And it turns out that in the United States, that correlation is even stronger when the recession has been coincident with a major financial crisis. And over the past 150 years, that pattern has held with 3 exceptions. One was the 1930s. Another was the relatively mild recession in the aftermath in the early 1990s. And then the third was the aftermath of 2008-2009. And so when we were studying this historically slow recovery, and by historically slow, I mean, on average in the post-war US period, it took 24 months to regain the jobs lost during the recession. After 2008-2009, it took 77 months to regain the employment loss in 2008-2009. So when we were studying this historically slow recovery, 2 anomalies in particular stood out to us. One was that in the midst of this recovery, so from July 2009, the start of the expansion, through the end of 2016, the prime age labor force in the United States shrank. So these are individuals between the ages of 25 and 54. And by December 2016, there were 1.6 million fewer of them either employed or actively looking for work than there were in July 2009. And this is despite the fact that this population is continuing to grow. So this wasn't just that the population of 25 to 54-year-olds was declining. A second anomaly was that firm's gross investment in new plant and equipment per worker, what we call capital deepening, was not sufficient to keep pace with depreciation of existing plant and equipment per worker. And this was almost unheard of in post-war US history. So when we were working on what ultimately became the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there were a couple of things that we wanted to do. One of them was to try to do something about this decline in labor force participation, some of which was secular, you might say, due to the aging of the baby boom generation. So the peak cohort of the baby boom generation was 1957. Those folks turned 62 in 2019. 62 is the key year where you see a bunch of retirements. So some of it was structural, but some of it was also these trends in prime-age labor force participation. So we did a couple of things in the 2017 tax law to try and get at this. One is to take a lot of these tax expenditures in the US tax code that often are quite inefficient from an economic perspective. Often they skew toward the highest end of the income distribution, limit some of those tax expenditures, and plow the savings into marginal personal income tax rate reductions, which can have an effect on labor force participation, particularly among older workers, who tend to be more responsive to changes in marginal personal income tax rates. So what we did is we capped the deduction for state and local taxes, which is a tax expenditure that massively skews to the highest income households. We capped the mortgage interest deduction, and then we plowed those revenue savings into marginal income tax rate reductions across the board. Then we also almost doubled the standard deduction. So one of the things about doubling the standard deduction is that it helps smooth some of those effective marginal tax rates as people start to earn income. Another thing we did, and this is one that I sort of have a tortured relationship with, is the child tax credit. The child tax credit is a complicated thing because as it phases out with income. And so as it phases out, you start to lose that tax credit, which means effectively you're facing a higher implicit marginal tax rate, which can have some labor force disincentive effects. On the other hand, as it phases in, it helps to offset the phase out of the earned income tax credit. So we can effectively lower implicit marginal tax rates as it phases in. Especially if you do as we did in 2017, which is to make it refundable, meaning you can claim the credit even if you don't have any federal income tax liability, but it has to be refundable only against earned income, so meaning you have to be working. So that's how we designed it in 2017. And we also extended the phase-out thresholds. So fewer workers were covered by those higher implicit marginal tax rates as the child tax rate phased out. And that's on the labor side, or some of the principal things on the labor side. On the capital side, we recognized that the US faced the highest effective tax rates on capital, corporate income, in the advanced economy world by a pretty substantial margin. And so even if the absolute cost of capital was fairly low by historical standards, relatively we face a very high cost of capital. And so two of the key provisions there were to, first of all, lower the federal statutory corporate income tax rate from 35% to 21%, and also introduce full expensing of new equipment investments. So if you invest in a new piece of equipment, you can write that off in the tax year in which you make that investment. Whereas previously you had to depreciate it over 5 or 7 years, or with some types of assets even longer. And then the third thing was we wanted to lower the regulatory burden to facilitate new business formation, new business investment, and net new hiring. And when we look at some of the effects of this, it's very interesting to see what the data were suggesting. So first and foremost, with investment, you can estimate, and you can do it by a bunch of different ways, but basically estimate a trend in the growth rate of business investment over the expansion period from July 2009 through the end of 2016. You can project that trend growth rate into 2018, 2019, and then you can reconstruct the levels of investment from those projected growth rates and calculate the difference between what investment actually did and what investment would have done had that pre-2017 tax law trend continued. And we see a 10% gap. So the level of investment at the end of 2019 was about 10% higher than that projected trend. And in part because of that higher capital stock, we also saw the rate of growth in US labor productivity rise from what had been an historically low 1.1% during the expansion through the end of 2016 to about 1.5, 1.6% in 2018, 2019. And the US was the only G7 economy to observe its labor productivity growth rise relative to its pre-2017 average. On the labor force participation front, while we observed labor force participation rates rise across the board, across all age cohorts, we actually did see the biggest, sharpest increases in labor force participation among those 55 and older, who, as I said earlier, do tend to be more responsive to changes in marginal personal income tax rates. Because if you're a younger worker, you work, you acquire human capital on the job, the present discounted value of the future flow of services from that incremental human capital that you acquire on the job is quite substantial, because you have a very long career ahead of you. Whereas as you get closer to retirement, that increment in the present discounted value, the future stream of human capital services is less, which is why older workers tend to be more responsive to those marginal personal income tax rate changes. But it wasn't just 55 and older. We actually saw, in contrast to that 2009 to 2016 period when 1.6 million prime age workers left the labor force, in 2017, 2018, 2019, we saw 2.3 million prime age Americans enter or re-enter the labor force, such that by the end of 2019, fully 3/4 of the flows into employment were individuals coming in from outside the labor force. We also saw substantial real inflation-adjusted wage gains across the income distribution, across the wage, income, and wealth distributions, but concentrated especially at the lower end of those distributions. So previously during the expansion, we had seen wage growth for those without a college degree lag that of those with a college degree, wage growth for those at the bottom 10% of the wage distribution lag that of those at the top 10%. Wage growth for workers lagged out of managers. In 2017, 2018, 2019, we actually saw a reverse of those trends. And real wage growth for the bottom 10% was just under 10%, 9.8%. For the top 10%, it was 4.8%. So again, real gains across the board, but skewed toward the lower end. And actually in 1 year alone, 2019, real median household income, so the inflation-adjusted income for the typical American household rose by $4,400, which was more in 1 year than in the entire 16 years from 2001 through 2016.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, despite of the fact that you have more people coming into the labor force, would put pressure down on wages. You saw wages grow. Is that it?
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, that is correct. So, because I think there are two things going on in the aftermath of 2017. One is there are supply side incentives, but on the other hand, there is an increase in labor demand, because you've just increased by 10% net investment demand today. That raises aggregate demand. You've also, to a certain extent, shifted the entire Mincer curve, because now that corporate tax rate is now at 21%. And furthermore, the other interesting thing about 2017 is that you know, there's a big literature, labor economics literature going back to the 1980s about profit sharing in industries. And you look across sectors, and more profitable sectors tend to pay higher wages because there's some bargaining that goes on between labor and capital. And so in 2017, a lot of firms faced a large one-off windfall, cash windfall, with the deemed repatriation of past foreign earnings. And so we actually at CEA predicted that that would be through this wage bargaining channel, that would result in higher wages on impact, because now you have this large cash windfall, some of which is negotiated with labor. So that's why, even though you have this supply side effect, we also had increased labor demand from increased net investment demand today, plus this near-term profit sharing that goes on in sectors facing deemed repatriation. And so actually, the interesting thing is, whereas in 2009 through 2016, we observed income inequality rising, we observed labor share of income falling, we observed wealth inequality rising. In the aftermath of the 2017 tax law, we actually saw income inequality decline by pretty much any measure. I mean, the Gini coefficient, ratio of income in the 90th percentile to the 10th percentile, 80th to 20th. We saw labor share of income rise, and we saw wealth inequality decline. So actually, in the aftermath of the 2017 tax law, whereas while real net worth for the top 1% of households increased by 8.9%, real net worth for the bottom 50% of households increased by 28.4%. Which is a pretty staggering statistic when you think about it. And part of it is just, you know, you're deeper into an expansion. You have a higher pressure labor market, but with so many of these variables, you can estimate that trend. You can test for a trend break, and in so many of these macroeconomic variables, you can reject the null hypothesis of no trend break with confidence. But you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, you don't have to buy the trend analysis. An alternative thing to do is just to go back and look at what professional forecasters were predicting before the 2017 tax law. And you can take the Congressional Budget Office, compare their pre-2017 tax law projections to post-2017 tax law actuals, and the U.S. economy added 7 million jobs, which was 5 million more than projected. In fact, in the first 2 months of 2020 alone, the U.S. economy added 465,000 jobs, which is more in 2 months than CBO had previously predicted would happen for the whole year. GDP was 1.2% larger at the end of 2019 than had been projected, and the unemployment rate 1.4 percentage points lower. Not sure how I'm doing on time, but so that's where we were on the eve of the COVID shock. And the pandemic hits in early 2020. And I think it's instructed to go back and just reflect on the magnitude of the shock, because it's easy now. The others, we're not quite on the other side, but I think it's easy now for us to say, well, that was quick. But in early 2020, experts from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, forecast that the U.S. economy would end 2020 12.2% smaller than it began 2020. And that was actually consistent with nowcasting, so real-time forecasting by the New York Fed, which Anis Nadir in March was projecting that the U.S. economy would end the year 11% smaller. And certainly, you look at the CBO's forecast in early 2020, they were projecting that the unemployment rate would spike to 16% and end the year still in double digits. Some private forecasters had the unemployment rate going to 25%. So basically, this was shaping up to be the worst macroeconomic shock since 1932 at least. in formulating a policy response to this shock, there were a number of considerations that were informing that thinking. One was that this was expected to be transitory. We are told by the public health experts 2 weeks of flatten the curve, although we did kind of realize that that was never going to be the case. We also realized that unlike in 2008, in 2020, we could reasonably operate on the assumption that on the eve of this shock, the US economy was for the most part efficiently allocated. Capital and labor and other resources were for the most part efficiently allocated. So we didn't have to have this big reallocation out of residential real estate, for example, into other sectors. And so a priority of policy in that context ought to be to preserve the contractual relationships that existed on the eve of this shock. Most importantly, the matches between employers and employees, which when you just had 24 consecutive months of the unemployment rate at or below 4%, are going to be relatively high quality matches. So you want to preserve those matches. And that's why we rolled out the Paycheck Protection program, which provided forgivable loans to qualified small businesses, provided they use those loans for payroll or for certain eligible fixed costs. We rolled out an employee retention tax credit, again, to help incentivize the retention of employees on payrolls. We also recognize that there's a lot of organizational capital that's embedded in firms, and especially in small businesses who don't maybe have a lot of physical capital. They do have a lot of knowledge and efficiencies that are embedded in that firm. And if the firm becomes insolvent, then all that organizational capital is lost. It may take some time to reconstitute, and all the while, markets for goods and labor are going to be operating at less than full capacity, so you're going to be operating at less than potential output. And so certainly the provision of credit through economic injury disaster loans was part of this, but another, and Carlos and I were talking about this earlier today, another, I think, underappreciated provision of the CARES Act was this temporary change in the treatment of net operating losses, which was a change that allowed firms to take net operating losses from 2020 and carry those back to 2018 or 2019 so that they could claim a tax refund on those losses against profits that they had previously earned. And not only does this provide a very helpful buffer in the event of an adverse shock to cash flow, it also does so at relatively low budgetary costs, because a firm's net operating loss in 2020 was always going to be a tax asset for them and a liability for the IRS, because either the firm managed to survive somehow and they claim the net operating loss against future profit, or the firm goes insolvent, they lose all that organizational capital, and the net operating loss becomes a tax asset under liquidation. Those are, in my view, the key business responses. On the individual side, there was a recognition that we were looking at 22 million Americans becoming unemployed all at once. Consumption is 70% of the US economy. Now you might say, well, this is why we have unemployment insurance, which replaces 50% of lost income. 22 million Americans becoming unemployed all at once and facing a 50% income loss is a pretty big deal for 70% of the US economy, which is why there was a consensus that there ought to be some temporary enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, a top up to that standard 50% replacement rate. Certainly, we would have preferred a replacement rate between 50 and 100%, at least maybe in March and April, 100%. I mean, when everything shut down, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that was ever going to have a big adverse effect on reemployment. But a lot of these state unemployment insurance systems were so antiquated that they could only do a lump sum top up. They couldn't do a percentage replacement rate. And then also there were concerns about the creaking infrastructure of the state unemployment insurance system. So on the one hand, you say, well, that's targeted, right? Because that is where the employment losses are. We want the aid to go through the UI system because that's where the income losses are. On the other hand, there were some concerns that the creaking infrastructure was just not able to keep pace with the velocity of the deterioration in the labor market. We saw a number of systems crash, and that was why there was an impetus to also do the economic impact payments at $1,200 per adult in a household plus $500 per child, because it can be done quicker. Now, when we look at the effects of the response, this was ultimately the shortest recession in U.S. history, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. It officially ended in 2020, in April 2020. And I think it makes sense that they would date it that way, because it's kind of hard to say that you're still in a recession, even though it's still tough environment. It's hard to say that you're still in a recession when in May 2020 you have job gains of 2.8 million, in June 2020 you have job gains of 4.8 million, 1.7 in July, 1.6 in August. By some recent estimates, the Paycheck Protection program alone is estimated to have saved 18.6 million jobs. This is the estimate of Falkender, Mirren et al. And the unemployment rate spiked to 14.7%, but then ended the year at 6.7%. And even if we take the broadest measure of labor market underutilization, so-called U6, which includes marginally attached workers, people who are working part-time involuntarily for economic reasons, that ended the year at 11.7%, which is actually lower than it was in August 2014. So about 5 years into the preceding expansion. And output, GDP, was 2.3% lower compared to that earlier OECD projection of 12.2%. And truth be told, we have sort of not a control group, but we have a comparisons group, meaning other advanced economies. And when we look across other advanced economies, the declines were much more consistent with those earlier OECD projections of sort of roughly 5 to 10%. And a lot of that, some of that is policy, some of that is just differential pandemic responses. But I think a good chunk of that was the nature of the economic policy response in the United States. And partly, one of the reasons that we saw a very swift rebound in retail spending was that income replacement, such that a household at the 10th percentile of the income distribution in April 2020, in the absence of any of the CARES Act, they would have faced a 13% decline in household income. Instead, they had a 165% increase in household income that then dissipated to a 7% increase in household income in August, relative to pre-pandemic, and that difference is actually even more stark if you consider just households at the lower end of the distribution who experienced job loss. I think another underappreciated, undercovered aspect of the economic policy response was actually the way in which it was tailored to serve some of the public health objectives. So there were things like relaxing scope of practice rules. So you don't want to have medical resources, healthcare resources strained in the middle of a pandemic, but if registered nurses and other healthcare professionals can provide some services that ordinarily they wouldn't be able to provide because of scope of practice restrictions, let's increase that capacity. Similarly, there was we engaged in a lot of deregulation for production and use of personal protective equipment. So PPE that previously was only approved for use in industrial settings could then be used, like N95 masks, could then be used in medical settings. The expanded use of telemedicine, because you want to be able to prevent strains on healthcare facilities, people who, especially if in the context of a contagious illness, if people can receive medical care at home via telemedicine, that ought to be a priority. And also there was temporary paid family leave, which was funded out through a refundable tax credit to firms. So if you're sick, the federal government wants you to remain at home rather than coming to the workplace and infecting others. And that was a temporary provision, as I said, funded out of through a refundable tax credit, and firms could access funds already deposited with the IRS in order to front that. And then finally, the other sort of deregulatory measure was the extensive use of emergency use authorization. So basically, all of the advanced therapeutics, remdesivir, convalescent plasma, that were released during 2020, those were all approved through emergency use authorizations. And actually, the vaccines that were delivered through Operation Warp Speed, those also were all distributed and delivered under emergency use authorizations. Now, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so just figured I would conclude with some sort of broader, bigger picture lessons. And I would say a big lesson learned when we look at both recoveries, the recovery from the slow recovery from after 2008, 2009, and the aftermath of the pandemic recession, is that macroeconomic policy can't just focus on the demand side, especially in the face of an adverse shock that is first and foremost a supply side shock. And we can recognize that while also recognizing that supply and demand can interact. So I actually agree with Larry Summers that I do believe in secular stagnation, but I see very much a supply side interpretation of secular stagnation. That if you are enacting a set of policies today that is expected to lower potential output tomorrow, then that is going to lower net investment demand today, which is going to result in lower potential, smaller capital stock tomorrow, lower potential output, lower productivity growth, which kind of feeds through in a rather unproductive spiral. And I worry at this moment that economic policy has learned perhaps precisely the wrong lessons from 2009. That the lesson learned from 2009 was that, well, we didn't go big enough. And therefore there's an incentive, there's an inclination to put the cart before the horse and to engage in large fiscal transfers without adequate attention to the supply side potential of the US economy. Carlos and I were talking earlier that when you look today at quit rates, when you look today at vacancy rates, when you look today at nominal wage gains, all these variables are pointing to a very tight US labor market. But it's a very tight US labor market at a level of employment that is still 4 million jobs short of February 2020 and between 7 and 8 million jobs short of where employment would be had pre-pandemic trend continued. And on top of that, there is a $1.8 trillion cumulative shortfall in business investment since the pandemic began. Now, $1.8 trillion, that's about 3% of the US capital stock. If you take the capital output ratio to be 3, that implies potential output is about 1% lower. And so we have, on the supply side, quite a few headwinds, and that is not even to mention the loss of human capital that was incurred in 2020 from on-the-job training, just human capital acquired through employment that was lost, potential human capital lost through school closures and hybrid learning. And so I worry today that what began as sort of the roaring 20s could very quickly become maybe not quite the stagflationary 1970s, but certainly there are considerable constraints on the supply side potential of the US economy at the same time that fiscal policy is continuing to maintain substantially elevated demand, which could pose some pretty thorny challenges to the monetary authority in navigating this. And so I will pause there to open the floor.
Question one for comment on the monetary response of those two shocks, so the two recessions, and are there anything to learn? Is there anything to learn in relation to the sort of fiscal side of it, and not only fiscal policy side of it, micro policy side that you talk a lot about? Is there anything else that you could add from the monetary side?
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, I think in the event of an adverse shock, you want to make sure that credit markets remain flowing, that firms retain access to credit. We in the CARES Act stood up quite a few new credit facilities and capitalized some credit facilities for the Federal Reserve to provide. A lot of those ended up not being used substantially. That's not necessarily a statement about their efficacy, because sometimes something doesn't have to be used in order for it to have been effective. Just the fact that it was there gives creditors confidence that their debtors, will be okay, because they have access to these credit facilities, so they won't face sort of a sudden credit crunch. I would say that both in the aftermath of 2008, 2009, and in the aftermath of 2020, there's a tendency to expect too much of monetary policy. And a lot of these trends, and certainly wealth inequality that we observed 2009 to 2016, were, if anything, amplified by monetary policy. And insofar as there are supply constraints, there's very little that monetary policy can do about that. I think that is why the challenge is for fiscal policy to make sure the incentives are right. The incentives are right to encourage domestic capital formation, to encourage increased labor force participation. And as we discussed earlier, I mean, it's great to have an increase in demand as well. But you want to have an increase in demand in combination with the right supply side incentives, because otherwise you just have a big increase in demand bumping up against an elastic aggregate supply curve, which doesn't do much good.
My question I have was on the you mentioned the OECD projections for all the countries in the developing world, and those projections probably at that point in time were projections that were assuming actually a milder path of the pandemic, and all the models in the very beginning, all the virus models, whatever, the epidemiology models, they were very pessimistic in deaths very quickly, but very few of them, if not any of them, predicted multiple waves. So this is not a differential equation they have in place, right? They're like one peaks and then herd immunity kicks in and comes down. That's basically what they all predicted, with very, very big peak, which we never had anywhere close to the big peaks. But then it came down and it came back again in summer in the West, and it came back again in the fall, right? So 2020, not only we had the March peak, we had the summer peak in multiple states, and we had the fall peak, which in some ways created multiple rounds of whether they were fully shut downs or partial shutdowns, or people don't do anything, and so on and so forth. So I would imagine that those predictions from the OECD might have been more optimistic even than they would have been if they were, we're going to go through 3 cycles of the virus in 2020.
I hadn't thought of that before, but I think you are correct. And actually, the 12.2% from OECD was a double hit scenario, but that's not a triple hit scenario, which is what ended up happening. And it was a double hit scenario with a much shallower second hit than ultimately ended up being the case when in the United States, actually, and in Western Europe as well, the second and third waves actually ended up being actually worse than the first wave.
I'll stop.
So you talked a little about lowering the corporate tax rate to 21%. I was wondering, was that the lowest value that was feasible, or why stop at 21%?
So, I mean, the president initially wanted 15%, and then especially in the context of having no support from the Democratic side of the Senate, because this was proceeding under reconciliation. So you have 50 votes plus the vice president to break the tie. Every vote matters, and in a lot of the negotiation, there has to be compromise. Also, the budget authorization for the 2017 tax law was that it couldn't add to it couldn't go above $1.5 trillion in conventionally scored costs over the 10-year budget window. So there are lots of, as it's going through the official scoring process, you realize, there are lots of things that you need to pare this, trim that, add that. And the expansion of the child tax credit was one that added quite a bit of cost to the conventional score in later stages of the bill, and that's why these things get negotiated as the political process plays out. But it is kind of interesting to note that the 2017 tax law is often discussed as a large tax cut for corporations and the highest income households, when the reality is that it was a $1.5 trillion bill as scored by the Joint Committee on Taxation. Of that 1.5 trillion, 330 billion was on the corporate side. So that included the corporate tax rate cut plus the full expensing of equipment investment. And then on the revenue raising side on the corporate tax, there are actually some considerable revenue raisers because of deemed repatriation, which deemed previously earned foreign. I might as well bring it back and either invest it or return it to shareholders. So 330 billion net on the corporate side. Child tax credit was just under $600 billion. So that's, and also, I mean, you look at who was facing pretty much the only people, I mean, there's so much heterogeneity in the tax code. I mean, every household, every filer is so different. The circumstances are so unique. But in terms of large groups, the people facing the biggest income tax rate hikes on the individual side were the highest income filers in high tax states for whom that state and local tax deduction was a big deal. So it's just sort of interesting how narratives are formed. And also, I mean, actually, just very quickly, I mentioned the deemed repatriation. It was always a puzzle to me why share repurchases, also known as buybacks, were discussed with such horror, because as I understand it, that's sort of how efficient capital markets work. That you have a one-off windfall like deemed repatriation, and you have a few very highly profitable companies like Apple, like Google, like Facebook, who maybe don't have sufficient profitable investment opportunities. You want them to return that capital to shareholders so that they then invest it in other companies. And we saw this in the data. So a small subset of S&P 500 companies were basically net exporters of capital to other S&P 500 firms and other Wilshire 5000 firms and to private equity. So we saw a huge increase in private equity investments in the aftermath of the 2017 tax law, in part because of that exported capital. Now, is it troubling that a few firms like Apple and Facebook don't have a ton of profitable investment opportunities and feel the need to return it to shareholders? Maybe. But again, that's sort of how efficient capital markets work. Would you prefer that Apple just sit on a big cash pile in Dublin? I don't think so.
And there's opportunities to be sometimes larger in sort of newer, more risky activities than the big established companies anyway. So that reallocation was needed. In the eve of the pandemic, how cooperative were the legislative side in all the things that you were able to do? I'm not sure if you were able to pass through, but some of it was legislative, some of the Congress came along, but always mostly done through executive.
So a lot of deregulatory actions were through executive action, but I mean, obviously the 2017 tax law was legislatively done. I think the other thing that we worked very hard on as an administration was the 2018 Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, which, among other things, was an attempt to move away from the sort of one-size-fits-all approach to financial regulation of Dodd-Frank. Because it's potentially quite problematic if you are imposing the same stress tests on hundreds of financial institutions and the same metrics for passing those stress tests on hundreds of institutions, because then you are guaranteeing that every institution looks, that the balance sheet of every financial institution looks increasingly similar. You are killing diversification in the system, and any error in your policy, any error in your specification, you are guaranteeing is now multiplied across the financial architecture. So the 2018 piece of legislation was an attempt to provide a more tailored approach to that, and in part to allow some smaller financial institutions who, by the way, account for a bigger share of commercial and industrialized, a disproportionate share of commercial and industrial lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, to allow them to maintain just simple higher capital ratios rather than stress test determined tiered risk-weighted capital ratios. So I think that was another one, but a lot was done through executive action, through the agencies on the deregulatory front, which is hard to quantify the magnitudes of some of those effects, but we attempted in the 2020 economic report of the president to quantify the economic impact of some of the most salient regulatory actions.
Yeah, we have an online question. What would be the implication of the state and local tax deductions proposed in Congress on income and wealth inequality?
So it's difficult for me to answer because it's still in flux, but a repeal would be on a repeal of the cap. You're probably looking at $200 to $300 billion revenue loss over the budget window. And by the way, that includes the fact that the caps were scheduled to sunset anyway. So this is just the effect of a few years repeal of the state and local tax deduction. It does mean that the highest income households, those in the top 1% of the income distribution, I've seen some estimates. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but you're probably looking at a net tax cut for those households several orders of magnitude greater than any of the increase in transfer payments at the lower end of the income distribution. So I think from an equity perspective, it's pretty regressive, and from an efficiency perspective, as I said before, I would be much more in favor of limiting or eliminating those tax expenditures and plowing the savings into marginal rate reductions.
All right, thank you, Tyler, again. Thank you.
Thanks.
We have some time.
Yeah, that works.
Downstairs, we're next year. This morning,
This poor guy's got to sit for 2 hours.
I know, it's great. It's good. Oh, you came to both talk company. It's great. I'll send you the, so one thing that David's working on,